The meeting of the subcommittee is called to order, and today we are having a hearing on drug safety, an update from the FDA. And I think before I give my opening statement, I'm going to recognize my colleague, the ranking member of the full committee, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton.
Thank you, Chairman Plone. I just need to make an announcement to the subcommittee. The ranking Republican on the subcommittee is Congressman Nathan Deal of Georgia. As we all know, he announced several weeks ago his intention to resign effective last week. He has since withdrawn the effective date of his resignation until after the vote or votes on the House floor concerning the comprehensive health care bill. But during that time, Congressman Deal is not planning on attending Congress, or at least the subcommittee of which he is the ranking member. Therefore, today I am nominating Congressman Shimkus of Illinois to be the temporary ranking member. That's unofficial, obviously, because there's no such thing as temporary anything. But he will assume the duties of Congressman Deal until such time as Mr. Deal does effectively resign. When that happens, I will inform Mr. Waxman that it's my intention to make Mr. Shimkus the ranking member of this subcommittee, subject to committee approval of such designation. So for today's hearing and any subsequent hearings that this subcommittee has, until Mr. Deal actually resigns, Mr. Shimkus will assume the duties of the ranking member of this subcommittee.
Well, thank you. And let me congratulate Mr. Shimkus. He's always been a very helpful and tried to work in many cases on a bipartisan basis, so I'm very happy to welcome him as the new or acting ranking member. I was going to ask, though, the way you described that, Mr. Barton, it sounded like Mr. Deal might still be here for a while, depending on the circumstances, huh? All right. We'll have to see. I shouldn't say that, actually. He probably won't be here for very long, based on what I believe, but we'll see. In any case, congratulations. And let me introduce or recognize myself for an opening statement. As I mentioned, today the subcommittee is meeting to discuss drug safety. It has been at least a year since our last hearing on this issue, and we're here to get an update and overview from the FDA on current challenges and successes with respect to drug safety. Recently, there have been a number of drug-related incidences that have shaken public confidence in the FDA's ability to ensure that consumers are using safe and effective drugs. In addition, reports from the Institute of Medicine and the Government Accountability Office highlight the shortcomings of our current system and provide guidance on how to strengthen the drug safety laws to better protect the American public. In response to the incidences and the response I should say in response, Congress passed the FDA Amendment Acts of 2007, or FDA, I guess it's pronounced, FDA. This bill was aimed to provide the FDA with additional authorities, specifically post-approval authorities that would help the agency keep drugs safe for consumers to use. For example, the bill provided the FDA with the authority to require drug manufacturers to conduct post-approval studies that would monitor drugs for safety as they are used in the broader population. The bill directed the FDA to establish a post-market surveillance system to improve the agency's ability to detect and act upon drug safety problems, and gave the FDA the authority to require drug label changes for safety reasons. It also provided the FDA with the authority to impose risk evaluation mitigation strategies, or REMS, for drugs and biologics when necessary. And these REMS are designed to manage known or potential serious risks with a drug or biologic to ensure that the benefits of the product outweigh the risks it poses to the patient. Now, the FDA is here today to talk about how effective this law is in protecting the American people from unsafe drugs, and I'm particularly curious to hear about the progress on the implementation of some of the post-approval authorities and to learn from the agency of potential stumbling blocks or challenges that will require further congressional action. Outside of the FDA realm, however, we already know that we need to do more to ensure the safety of our drugs. We all remember that horrible incident in early 2008 that again intensified this committee's focus on drug safety. Baxter Healthcare Corporation, one of the manufacturers of the blood thinner heparin, which is used to prevent blood clots, began noticing an increase in the number of adverse events associated with their product. After further investigation, it was determined that the Baxter heparin contained a counterfeit ingredient that mimics an ingredient normally used in heparin production, but that is highly toxic and dangerous to humans. Baxter had received this ingredient from a manufacturer in China, and upon further investigation by the FDA, it was determined that due to a processing error at the agency, this Chinese manufacturer had never been inspected by the agency. Tragically, 81 individuals lost their lives as a result of the contamination. Obviously, this should not and cannot happen again, and we must do everything we can to ensure that it does not happen again. And I'm curious to hear the FDA's thoughts and plans for improving import and supply chain safety, especially since the GAO found that roughly 80% of the active ingredients used in drugs are actually manufactured abroad. I and a few of my colleagues on the Energy and Commerce Committee introduced a bill this Congress that aims to provide the FDA with additional funding and authorities to better regulate the imported materials used in drugs. The bill would also place more responsibility on the manufacturers to ensure that the ingredients they're using are safe. As highlighted by the heparin case, we know the devastation that can come from an unsafe drug supply chain. So I'm looking forward to hearing from today's witnesses, and I now recognize our new ranking member, my friend Mr. Shimkus.
Thank you, Chairman Pallone. Thank you for your warm welcome. I want to thank Ranking Member Barton for his trust and confidence in me, and I look forward to continue to work hard on behalf of the committee and really the work we need to do here. The FDA, with all the challenges and the inspection that we do of it, is still really the gold standard for health and safety in the world. A lot of countries don't have to do all the research and the testing because we, in essence, do it for them. So although we'll be inquisitive and we'll be trying to ask questions, I put that first on the table because they do really rely, the world does rely on what we do here. And we have spent a great deal of time on the issue of drug safety and the Food and Drug Administration Amendments Act. And I look forward to Dr. Sharfstein, welcome, and I look forward to your updates. And I want to continue to learn more about the risk evaluation mitigation strategies known as REMS, how that's progressing and whether information is being disseminated in a user-friendly manner. I'm all about risk-based approach. In the food and drug, the bills that we passed in a bipartisan manner, I continue to spoke out on risk-based programs. So I'm very interested in that. Your projections for advisory committee members in the future, and then those projections, I believe, is important to maintain credibility and expert participants. Recent stories indicate the exceptions reduction provisions may be diluting advisory committee's ability to serve in those functions, and we do want highly qualified and the best people to be helpful. But in general, we know gaps remain when it comes to ensuring the safety of drugs in the U.S., and I remain committed to addressing those needs along with Chairman Pallone. One thing I know about my colleagues on the other side, they are tenacious in moving in that direction, and we want to be helpful in that manner. The FDA continues to make progress in utilizing risk-based systems like PREDICT, and I'm curious how this might translate in regard to targeting facility inspections. Regardless of the end result, we know that FDA needs proper funding. We need to identify where we can cut out wasteful spending and make sure funding to ensure the safety of food and drugs in this country does not take a backseat with our appropriators. Lastly, echoing remarks I made in the past, I hope we can work towards these goals using a proven formula to get a good bipartisan product. Chairman Waxman, Chairman Emeritus Dingo, Chairman Pallone, and Chairman Stupak, working along with Ranking Member Barton, Deal, and myself, came up with the food safety bill that ultimately passed the House really in a huge bipartisan manner. And I think we can do that if we move forward in that direction. I look forward to continue our work to get legislation signed into law and hope we can use the successes of the food safety as our motto in any drug safety-related legislation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Shimkus. Next is our full committee chair, Chairman Waxman.
Thank you very much, Chairman Pallone, for holding this hearing today and giving us the opportunity to hear from the FDA on the critically important issue of drug safety. When our committee focused on the, it's been some time that we focused on drug safety, but we did indicate that we wanted to take up this bill after food safety, which was the first step. And now we are going to turn to drugs, medical devices, and cosmetic safety issues. We can't forget the lessons of the 2007 heparin contamination catastrophe, which resulted in numerous severe allergic reactions and the deaths of at least 80 Americans. In that case, the active ingredients was manufactured in China. Thanks to the excellent work of the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations in 2008, we know that this is not a unique situation. The U.S. drug supply is increasingly sourced from abroad. In order to market a drug in the U.S., FDA must ensure that the drug meets our appropriately high safety standards. So when ingredients or finished drug products are manufactured abroad, FDA needs to expand its reach if the agency is to meet its responsibilities. As heparin illustrated, FDA clearly needs more authorities and more resources to do a better job policing the safety of imported products. But what heparin also demonstrated is that we cannot expect FDA alone to do this job. We need to place a greater onus on all manufacturers to oversee the safety of their own products. This principle is reflected in the work that Mr. Dingell, Mr. Pallone, and Mr. Stupak did on their Food and Drug Administration Globalization Act. For instance, the bill would require drug manufacturers to implement quality risk management plans to incorporate risk identification and control into their production processes. We need that. This is a principle that should be familiar to all of us. The Food Safety Enhancement Act reflects this kind of approach with respect to food manufacturers, so I'm confident that we can get the same kind of bipartisan agreement to incorporate this concept into a bill on drug safety as well. I hope FDA will tell us today about what the agency believes it needs to protect us from another heparin disaster. I'm also eager to hear about FDA's implementation of the 2007 FDA Amendments Act. Congress made some major strides toward improving the safety of our drug supply and enacting this legislation. For the first time, FDA was given the authority to require manufacturers, among other things, to conduct post-market studies, implement risk evaluation and mitigation strategies, or REMS, and make safety-related drug labeling changes. This hearing will be a great opportunity to learn about FDA's challenges and successes with the use of these authorities 3 years after enactment of this landmark legislation. I want to thank Dr. Sharfstein for being here. He's no stranger to me. We've worked together in the past in the Oversight and Government Reform Committee and on many of these very same issues. And I'm quite pleased that you're here and feel a sense of confidence that you are responding to us on these issues because I know you share our concern about them. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman Waxman. Next is our ranking member, Mr. Barton.
Thank you, Chairman Pallone. We appreciate this hearing today. We appreciate our witness from the FDA coming. Before I give my brief statement on the merits of the issue, I do want to reiterate the importance I place on this subcommittee, and the importance I place on Mr. Shimkus assuming the ranking membership. On the Republican side, we have a bidding system for subcommittees where each member gets to rank 1, 2, 3, their preference for subcommittees. The most sought-after subcommittee on the Republican side of the full committee is the Health Subcommittee, and as it should be, given the size of the health issue in our debates here in the Congress. Congressman Deal has done an outstanding job, first as subcommittee chairman and the last 2 terms as ranking member, but he is pursuing the governorship in Georgia. So I thought long and hard about who to replace him with, and Mr. Shimkus is somebody who has paid his dues. He has an almost 100% attendance record as a member of this subcommittee. He also serves on 2 other subcommittees, and his attendance record there is excellent. He gets into the nut and the details of the issues, and while any member of the subcommittee on the Republican side, I think, would make an excellent ranking member, I feel like in Mr. Shimkus will have somebody who will not have a learning curve. So I welcome him to his new duties, and I hope that he conveys to them the same sense of excellence he has in all the other duties he's assumed on the committee. With regard to today's hearing, it is good to review what we've done with the bill that we passed in the last Congress. We are especially interested on the minority side, as has already been outlined. The REAMS issue, the risk evaluation and mitigation, how that's working. We also have would be interested in hearing about the new rules that we put into statute regarding conflict of interest and how those rules are being used. We hear some concern that it's become difficult to get the experts needed on these review panels because of the conflict of interest rules that we've adopted. So we want to hear about that. As Chairman Waxman has pointed out, there is hope that we can work in a bipartisan fashion on future FDA reform measures. Chairman Dingell and I are working on that very issue at the staff level, and we are hopeful that our friends on the majority side will adopt the model of bipartisanship that they exhibited in the last Congress and in this Congress so far with the FDA, and not the model of partisanship that they adopted on the larger comprehensive health reform bill. I think the proof is in the pudding. When we work together on a bipartisan fashion, we certainly have differences, but we end up with bills that pass committee with almost unanimous support and bills that pass the floor with over 400 votes. When the other route is chosen, we have bills that barely pass committee and barely pass the floor, and as of now, there doesn't appear to be a compromise between the House and the Senate and the President that can pass anywhere. So we look forward to our testimony, and again, Chairman Pallone and Chairman Waxman, thank you for this hearing.
Thank you, Mr. Barton. Next is the Chairman Emeritus. And I should say that Mr. Dingell, as many of you know, has been had a long history of working on this legislation or the issue of drug safety and food safety, and is the prime sponsor of the bill that we've been operating on for the last couple sessions on the topic. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for those kind words, and I wish to commend you for having this hearing. It is a very valuable event, and it will provide us an opportunity not only to receive and update information on drug safety activities at the Food and Drug Administration, but also to remind the American people of the hazards which exist with regard to unsafe foods and drugs, and the fact that this Congress needs to move forward with legislation to address problems in both of these areas. As you know, Mr. Chairman, we have reported from this Committee a Food Safety Bill, which has passed the House. It came unanimously out of this committee, and it has passed the House by an overwhelming vote. It sits, of course, safely ensconced in the United States Senate, as these things usually do. We are hopeful that this hearing might trigger some interest in the Senate in this matter so that they can commence to go forward. I want to commend my friend Mr. Barton for his comments with regard to food safety and safety of pharmaceuticals. As you know, Mr. Chairman, you, Mr. Stupak, and I, and Ms. Sutton and Ms. DeGette sponsor H.R. 759, which is a very significant improvement in all the things at Food and Drug, including their authorities to address drug problems, food problems, and also importation problems, and to deal with the importation at the point of import, and to see to it that inspections at home and abroad, and as well as that good manufacturing practices obtain abroad. And I want to observe that Mr. Barton worked very well with us on that, and that my Republican colleagues and my Democratic colleagues and I all worked well to get that bill out of here and through the House. Having on food safety, I'm hopeful that we can do something similar, either on the remnants of the legislation which we have passed, which was H.R. 759. We have received technical comments from the Food and Drug Administration, and we believe that those are very helpful and will be incorporated. As my colleague, Mr. Barton, has observed, his staff and mine are working to see to it that we can bring together a bill which can achieve the support of my colleagues on the committee, and I look forward to the enthusiastic support in this subcommittee and in the full committee. And of course, I look forward to the help of Food and Drug and the Department of HHS as well as the administration. According to a 2004 HHS report, the nation's medicine cabinets are still stuffed with enormous amounts of pharmaceuticals. Almost half of all people in this country take at least one prescription medicine, and 1 in 6 has 3 or more medications that they take. Americans have come to expect that their prescription drugs will improve health and prolong life expectancy. They do not expect their drugs to cause harm or death. Food and Drug Administration plays a critical role in ensuring the nation's drug supply meets the safety expectations of American consumers. The role FDA plays is so critical that it has earned that agency and American food and pharmaceutical products as the gold standard, not only of regulatory bodies, but as of regulatory substances. Unfortunately, FDA approval of pharmaceuticals as the gold standards is now called into question by an unfortunate series of facts. Drug safety incidents have occurred and have created a confidence crisis in FDA. During the past 8 years, Food and Drug was led by leadership that specialized at best in gross incompetence or at worst severe deception. And as a result, the American lives have been placed in jeopardy under all the products that are marketed under the regulation of that agency. And of course, the confidence of American people in that agency has been severely compromised. Now, under a new administration, Food and Drug has been taking steps to rebuild. And through congressional and administrative action, the agency has gained additional resources. Not sufficient, but to begin enabling it to move towards doing its job properly. Though many of myself, including myself, still believe that the resources and authorities of Food and Drug are still lacking in the waste of years of inattention and starvation. In 2007, the Congress made substantial progress in the way of drug safety with the passage of FDA Amendments Act of 2007. This law strengthened FDA's post-market safety oversight. No longer is it okay for the oversight to end at the mere approval of a drug. This is a significant step forward. However, it did not take long before we were aware of enormous gaps in FDA's ability to protect consumers from an increasingly global drug supply. In 2008, in one instance alone, 81 deaths of Americans were linked to recalled heparin that contained Chinese tainted API. The safety of imported pharmaceuticals and supplies, as well as the raw materials from which these are made, is a matter of safety and great concern that must be addressed in this Congress. Last year, the Congress unanimously passed the bipartisan bill I mentioned with regard to our food safety supply. I believe that we can and should and will pass similar legislation during this Congress. I look forward to the Deputy Commissioner's testimony. I hope he is able to give us better testimony than the predecessor of the current head of FDA gave us when he came up to tell us that all was well and to leave a patch of skin behind in this committee because of the unfortunate character of his testimony and his lack of information. Mr. Chairman, I thank you again, and I yield the balance of my time.
Thank you, Chairman Dingell. Gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Boyer.
Thank you very much. For the past several years, I have been studying the problem of counterfeit drugs entering our nation through our 12 international mail facilities and express carrier facilities. In 2008, Congressman Mathis and I introduced the Safeguarding America's Pharmaceuticals Act to combat the flow of unapproved drugs into our country and to strengthen and safeguard the domestic pharmaceutical supply by creating also this system of electronic pedigree. At the beginning of last year, when we submitted this, introduced the legislation, we then submitted it to the FDA. and to other stakeholders, Customs Border Protection and the California Board of Pharmacy, to improve the Safeguarding America's Pharmaceuticals Act. I would ask you to look over your left shoulder because there are two ladies that played a lot of help and put in a lot of time for the technical assistance. Elisa Bernstein, thank you very much. We traveled to many of these facilities with you. And Jeannie Ireland, thank you very much for the technical assistance you've given to make this legislation even better. I have Mr. Masson and I had the commitment of Mr. Dingell, and we want to make sure that this legislation becomes a reality. Last June, Dr. Hamburg testified before this subcommittee and stated that the problem of counterfeit drugs is a significant concern and gave her commitment to working with me to address the issue. So I in turn asked for the very same commitment. The FDA then followed up in its response to many questions for the record and confirmed that the agency supports a single national uniform standard for a drug track and trace system. Additionally, the agency addressed an issue of great importance to me when it stated that it supports the streamlining the destruction of these unapproved FDA drugs that constantly come into the market. And let's stop enabling these counterfeiters by this policy of return to sender. It's just awful, and hopefully that you can address that to us. The worldwide counterfeit drug market is expected to grow $75 billion. So we have to aggressively address this, and I look forward to working with Mr. Dingell to do that. So I know this is a great concern to you, and I look forward to working with you and your comments. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Boyer. Next is the gentlewoman from the Virgin Islands, Mrs. Christensen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm waiving my opening statement.
Thank you. She's not here. Gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Gingrey.
Mr. Chairman, before I start, let me join with my ranking member in congratulating Mr. Shimkus as ranking member of this Health Subcommittee. Mr. Chairman, first I'd like to thank you for calling this hearing today. Ensuring that medications are both safe and effective for our nation's patients is a goal that I believe we can all support. Whether our inquiries include pre-market and post-market testing of products, domestic and foreign facility inspections, or even the authority and resources of the FDA, this committee and its chairman should be commended for their efforts today. However, I want to focus for a moment on some troubling news that just came out of Britain. As some of you may have read earlier this week, the UK's National Health Service received 4 independent audits on the overall state of their healthcare system. All 4 reports found a system that put the politics of the government above the health of the patient. One report, based on the evidence of almost 200 top managers and doctors in the British system, found that hospitals ignored basic hygiene so they could cram patients into beds to meet waiting time targets, thereby losing sight of fundamental hygiene requirements for infection prevention. This neglect of the most basic hygienic standards was credited with causing the deaths of 265 patients in 2005. All 4 reports, in fact, hit the same note. The British system placed little emphasis on patient care. Even more shocking, these reports were suppressed by the British government and only came to light recently. To quote the Times of London, these reports diagnose a blind pursuit of political and managerial targets as the root cause of a string of hospital scandals that have cost thousands of lives, end quote. I see the same blind pursuit of political targets in our current health care reform debate. For the past week, I've seen the demonization of the insurance industry. Sure, the industry needs reform. We all agree with that. But insurance reforms alone should not be the reason for turning health care over to our government, lock, stock, and barrel. And if the Senate bill passes, what then? Who's going to monitor our government when it controls all health care decisions? If the British are our example, will politics supersede the needs of patients here, like they did in the UK? I fear that Washington politics have already trumped their needs. Our constituents are telling us that they want reform, but not this reform. They don't want a bill bought with political payoffs and backroom deals. Every day they echo these sentiments, yet their elected officials ignore them. They voted for a Republican to represent Massachusetts in the United States Senate, and still Washington refuses to listen. If we cannot trust our government to put its citizens first when debating a health care reform bill, how can we expect it to safeguard their citizens' interests when it controls health care? If Britain continues to be our example, I fear for the safety of patients if our government controls our health care choices. Mr. Chairman, with that, I yield back.
Thank you. Next is the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Braley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm very pleased that we're holding this important hearing, and I'm very pleased with the scope of the testimony that Dr. Sharfstein has laid out in his written materials. I want to begin my brief remarks by echoing the concern raised by my colleague from Indiana, Mr. Booyer, because one of the things that was very obvious to me when I visited the Custom and Border Patrol inspection facilities in Nogales, Arizona, and Mexico is that we have an enormous problem with counterfeit drugs entering through ports of access and other places that are not being controlled, which contributes enormously to the problem you've identified with the known points of production for non-counterfeit drugs. So we've got two major problems in terms of enforceability of the FDA's mandate in counterfeit and non-counterfeit production facilities overseas. We also have enormous challenges in terms of the accountability of the manufacturers of those non-counterfeit and counterfeit drugs in this country. And one of the things that I hope you're able to address in your testimony is what the FDA is doing to promote greater accountability with those overseas manufacturers. I also want to compliment you on some of the progress that's been made since the passage of the FDAA, because I personally benefited from one of the changes you identified in your statement where you described the changes to the prescription information of a class of antibiotics to warn about the risk of tendon rupture. I have experienced a ruptured Achilles tendon, and when I was diagnosed with those antibiotics, as a patient, I was given informed information to make a choice about whether or not to take that antibiotic in light of my own health history. So I can tell you that if consumers are presented with information that allows them to make the choices that are best for them based upon their own unique health conditions, the FDA is fulfilling the mandate that you set forth so succinctly at the beginning of your written remarks. But I also want to hear from you in your testimony about the Sentinel initiative that you describe, which you have identified as a national integrated electronic system for monitoring medical product safety. The concern I want you to address is exactly what model that Sentinel initiative is based upon, because I'm familiar with other Sentinel event reporting systems that have been adapted in this country, designed to promote patient safety, that have been woefully inadequate in reaching the level of reporting that would be required to truly bring about changes in patient safety. So I look forward to your comments. I appreciate your willingness to come here today. It's a very important subject that affects every American, and this is not a partisan issue. It's a bipartisan issue that every American should be concerned about, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Braley. The gentlewoman from Tennessee, Ms. Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am so pleased that we are doing an oversight hearing today. Oversight is something that we should be doing a little bit more of. And I think that after we passed the FDA Amendments Act in '07 that was supposed to help streamline some of those processes and procedures, that it is important that we come back and look at what is happening with the efficiencies in this area, as well as to look at the relationship between the FDA and industry. And some of my colleagues have mentioned some of the conflict of interest questions that we will have. I also hope that today we're going to look at whether or not the FDA has the appropriate resources as well as the institutional will to continue to evolve and review processes that are in place. And I know, Dr. Sharfstein, that you're very well aware that with the inspections process with INDA and ANDA, we hear from constituents who may have questions or concerns as they have gone through that process. So I think that's something we need to jointly look at to say, is this review process working, and how do we simplify it? How do we look at time, money, the usage, as well as public safety? So I thank you for your willingness to look at that. The other point that I hope we look to is FDA's internal problems and see if those have improved, not only with the decision-making process, but also the oversight and the post-market drug safety issues that are out there, the counterfeits. And then let's also touch on one of the things we've talked about repeatedly over the last few years, which is your interagency communications and the different divisions and how they are transferring that information. Repeatedly, we have seen this as a roadblock or being cited as well. We didn't know they were doing. So I hope that you will take a moment to address that. I thank you for being here with us. We welcome you. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Blackburn. Next is the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Eshoo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is an important hearing, and I thank you for having it. Before the FDA was created about a century ago, taking drugs was a real gamble. There were elixir, potions, and that were sold door to door, and quote, medicines were really taken at one's own risk. Today, as was stated previously, and we all know, there are millions of Americans that take drugs to prevent, to treat, and to cure ailments from the common cold to cancer. And as science and technology progresses, and I see every day the new things that surface in my congressional district and certainly around the country, so do the complexity of drugs. As well as our ability to regulate them and ensure their safety. So I think that the FDA is the gold standard in the world, and I think that we all want the FDA to remain the gold standard in the world. The recent heparin incident was a stark example of what happens when that standard is not followed, and it cost 181 American lives. Lapses in drug safety not only harm patients, but they cause the public, and I think this is really an important outcome of this. It causes the public to doubt the government's ability to actually ensure safety. So we have to maintain the trust and the support of the American people who rely on safe and effective drugs. I'm very pleased to see Dr. Sharfstein here today. I'd like to know about how the FDA is implementing two provisions that I offered in the Food and Drug Administration Amendments Act to renew and improve the Best Pharmaceuticals for Children Act, the BPCA, and the Pediatric Research Equity Act, PREA, P-R-E-A. The provisions, as you know, were designed to improve drug safety for children in two ways. First, under the BPCA, the legislation provided an alternative or an incentive for a drug if the innovator company agrees to undertake comprehensive pediatric studies requested by the FDA. And second, under PREA, the FDA was granted the authority to require studies when there's a demonstrated need and the drug companies are required to submit a pediatric assessment. I'm telling you what you already know. So my thanks to Dr. Sharfstein for being here today. I look forward to your testimony. I want to thank everyone that is part of helping to keep FDA as the gold standard in the world, and to work with you and make sure that we provide the resources that you need in order to do that, and good public policy to back it up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Next is the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Pitts.
I'll waive.
Thank you. Gentleman, is he there? Gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Barrow. Gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Whitfield.
Thank you, Chairman Pallone, and I also want to congratulate Mr. Shimkus on his new responsibilities with this subcommittee. And Dr. Sharfstein, we're delighted you're here to bring us up to date on the implementation of this Act of 2007. People have already touched on a lot of these issues, the safety of drugs coming into the country, the approval process, whether or not there's adequate resources. And I just want to point out one additional aspect of this, which is a little bit different. But this committee, a couple of years ago, passed the National Prescription Drug Monitoring System, which I think is vitally important to healthcare providers. We continue to struggle on getting sufficient funds to fully implement this because of an unauthorized program started in the Appropriations Committee. But we've been working with both sides of the aisle to try to address that issue, and certainly look forward to your testimony on the other part of this equation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Whitfield. Gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Murphy. Oh, well, Mr. Green just walked in. You want to go first? Mr. Green.
I'd like to put my full statement into the record. And following our Chairman Emeritus and the earlier opening statements, first I want to thank you for holding the hearing. And today with new FDA folks on the current status of our drug safety system. And a lot of us are frustrated that the Senate hasn't moved on the bill. But I had the opportunity, like a lot of members, on several hearings led by Chairman Pallone and Chairman Stupak, the FDA and drug safety over the past 2 years. All these hearings clearly show the FDA has been woefully underfunded and neglected by Congress for far too many years. And that's left the FDA without the resources, funding, or technology it needs to protect the American public from counterfeit or tainted drugs entering our country. This committee worked over a year on a drug FDA safety legislation passed out of the committee. The legislation is aimed to improve our drug safety system by giving FDA increased resources for overseeing facility inspections by the FDA, an up-to-date registry of all foreign drug manufacturing facilities, country of origin labeling, verification of drug purity and safety. It gives the FDA the ability to issue fines and mandatory recalls. And also the FDA's foreign drug inspection programs needs to be changed and some hurdles to overcome. The FDA currently does not have the authority to conduct these inspections overseas and may be invited to a plant. It must be invited to a plant to conduct inspections. That's almost like me driving down the Houston freeway inviting an officer to watch me while I speed. That just doesn't work in the real world. And, Mr. Chairman, that's why I would hope with new FDA that they will not only take their job seriously, because I know they do, but also we need to provide the resources for them. And I appreciate the opportunity to give the opening statement. Again, I'd like to have the full statement placed in the record.
Without objection, so ordered. Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll waive opening statement and reserve time for questions. Welcome, Dr. Sharfstein, to our committee.
Thank you. Gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Dr. Sharfstein. In your testimony, you recite some of the examples of safety lapses that we've seen, and you summarize by saying, quote, these episodes and others are not random mistakes. They're driven by a common feature, which is economic incentive. And I guess it underscores what we've seen as a facet of our healthcare system for a very long time. Too often, profit is being put ahead of quality and safety. And everything we do, whether it's changing the way that the FDA works or whether it's the discussions surrounding healthcare reform, have to be around reversing that phenomenon. We have to be putting safety and quality first, profit and cash second, whether it's running the FDA, whether it's how we reimburse providers, or whether it's how we regulate insurers. I don't begrudge drug companies for making a buck. We got a lot of very good ones in Connecticut, but we should never, ever be sacrificing safety for profit. We should never, ever be sacrificing quality for profit. That, I think, is the guiding principle behind healthcare reform, and that, of course, I know is the principle that you bring to your leadership at the FDA. I appreciate your testimony today.
Thank you. The other Mr. Murphy from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd first like to mention that I'm unfortunately not going to be able to remain here with Chairman and Dr. Sharpstein, although I would love to hear your testimony about it, because you know what it's like. We have other things pending. But I'd like to bring something to your attention in this, and if it's not something you're able to respond to today, please hope you can get back to me. I wanted to tell you about a couple of my constituents, Russell and Robley Brusewitz of Mount Lebanon. They have lived a terrible tragedy. Their daughter, Hannah, was vaccinated for DPT, as you know, diphtheria, pertussis, and tetanus. And 2 hours after she received a shot, she began experiencing seizures. She was once a healthy infant, and now she needs 100% round-the-clock care. Unfortunately, adverse reactions to complicated vaccines do occur, and years upon years of scientific evidence have shown the public health benefits of vaccination are greater than the isolated, unfortunate adverse reaction. And to encourage families to vaccinate their children and ensure vaccine makers continue producing life-saving medicine, Congress passed the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act in 1986. This law compensates victims of vaccination adverse events and allows the Secretary of Health and Human Services to automatically award damages when a victim has experienced adverse reactions. But the DPT vaccine in this case was removed from the table of vaccines known to cause adverse events just 1 month prior to when Hannah's family applied for compensation. After a 10-year legal battle to prove that the vaccine caused Hannah's seizures, the case is now before the Supreme Court. Hannah's parents believe there were safer alternatives to the DPT vaccine administered to their daughter. The question before the Supreme Court is whether or not companies are immune to civil suits if they participate in vaccine victims' compensation fund. Now, I'm not here to argue the merits of the case. The Supreme Court to decide whether or not that was the congressional intent. But this case raises an important issue about vaccine safety. For example, if they are imported and the FDA is not capable of inspecting the manufacturing process, then where does the responsibility and liability for assuring safety lie? By the way, that particular DPT vaccine was later removed from the market after 50 years of sales. So I hope at some point you can get back to us and let us know about some of these important issues. I know you're deeply concerned, as are we, and quite frankly, I believe that contrary to what some others may say, that manufacturers also want to assure the safety of their products. They do not want to see anybody harmed from these as well. So if you could please get back to us, let us know how we keep up to date on the latest scientific evidence here and how you're ensuring vaccine makers are using the latest and safest innovation in vaccine design. Thank you so much for being here. Again, I apologize. I wish I could stay because I was deeply interested in hearing your testimony, but I look forward to hearing from you. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Murphy. A gentleman from Utah, Mr. Matheson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do appreciate this hearing and look forward to the testimony. In the coming weeks, I will be introducing a bipartisan bill with my colleague, Representative Bouyer, to develop a system for the protection of our nation's pharmaceutical supplies from domestic and international counterfeiting threats. In the past 2 years, Representative Bouyer and I have engaged stakeholders all along the supply chain to develop a workable and common sense approach. As an integral part of the stakeholder process, I also appreciate the recent helpful comments from the Food and Drug Administration and their suggestions of how to improve upon our approach and achieve our shared ultimate goal. Specifically, core elements of the bill that we plan on introducing are the creation of a system by which we will be able to track drugs from the time they leave the manufacturing facility to the time they reach patients in the pharmacy, hospital, nursing home, or doctor's office. Counterfeiting of drugs is a public health concern. By implementing these steps now, we can go a long way towards safeguarding the medicine people need to get well and stay healthy. Another feature will be to have one uniform national pedigree system. By having one federal standard, I believe we can ensure our nation's drug market is efficient and can ensure products flow safely and freely throughout the country. This is a guiding principle that seems to unite a majority of the members of the supply chain. Third, our bill will raise the standards for drug wholesalers while maintaining states' rights to regulate drug wholesalers. I believe this is a necessary step to ridding the market of bad actors and ensuring that anyone handling America's pharmaceuticals must be held to high standards. You know, counterfeit drugs are the latest and potentially the most dangerous front in the long-running battle against intellectual property crimes. In 2007, pharmaceuticals made up about 6% of total seizures. Last year, they accounted for 10% to become the third largest category with an estimated market value of $28 million. Counterfeiters are alarmingly good at their jobs. They can create pills and drug packages that are so close to the real products that they are indistinguishable to consumers. By strengthening current laws and regulations, building upon the successful model signed into law in California, and by creating a uniform national standard, our legislation further secures the healthcare supply chain. This enhances our country's and the Food and Drug Administration's high standard of patient safety. I look forward to the witness testimony. I'll yield back my time.
Thank you. Gentlewoman from Colorado, Ms. DeGette. Thank you. And I think, oh, I'm sorry, without objection, so ordered. I think that concludes our opening statements by members of the subcommittee, so we'll now turn to our one witness, which we're so pleased. Dr. Joshua M. Sharfstein is here today. He's the Principal Deputy Commissioner from the Food and Drug Administration, and thanks for being here. We're coming back, I guess. So if you'd give us your statement, we'd appreciate it.
Sure. Thank you very much. It is good to be back here. Good morning, good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. I'm Dr. Joshua Sharfstein, the Principal Deputy Commissioner at the Food and Drug Administration. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss the safety of the U.S. drug supply. Protecting Americans from unsafe or contaminated drugs is not just an important responsibility of FDA. It is our core charge. Drug safety was the primary reason for the passage of our guiding statute. In 1937, more than 100 people, including many children, died from ingesting elixir sulfanilamide, which contained the deadly poison diethylene glycol. Congress then passed, and President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act to prevent future catastrophes. And yet, as you know, many years later, the threat of unsafe drugs remains. I would like to thank the subcommittee for its tremendous leadership on this issue twice. First, thank you. There have been numerous hearings in this chamber that have helped the public understand the challenge of regulating a global marketplace. And second, members of this subcommittee, along with the chairman of the full committee and the chairman emeritus, were the key architects of the Food and Drug Administration Amendments Act of 2007. Which gave the agency significant new authorities and resources to address the safety of drugs. In this testimony, I will cover both of these important issues, import safety and the implementation of the drug safety authorities in what we call FDAA. Globalization has created new risks and challenges for the safety of the drug supply. Where Americans once used drugs that were mostly manufactured domestically, now up to 40% of the drugs we take are imported, and up to 80% of the active pharmaceutical ingredients in these drugs are from foreign sources. This makes oversight significantly more difficult and leaves weaknesses through which counterfeit, adulterated, and misbranded products can infiltrate the legitimate supply chain. That was the case with the contamination of heparin in 2007 and 2008, and most recently with the counterfeit Tamiflu discovered during the H1N1 outbreak. When the modern FDA was created in 1938, imports were a tiny part of the products used in our country. Now that an estimated 20 million shipments of FDA-regulated imports come into this country every year, FDA must adopt a new approach, one that addresses product safety by preventing problems at every point in the global supply chain, from the raw ingredient through production and distribution, all the way to U.S. consumers. In the food arena, this approach to prevention is embodied in legislation passed by this subcommittee and the full House of Representatives, which is now awaiting action in the Senate. In the area of drugs and other medical products, we are taking a number of steps to begin making this shift as best we can with our current authorities. But there is much more to be done. As Secretary of Health and Human Services Kathleen Sebelius noted when she appeared before this committee, FDA needs additional tools to move our oversight capabilities into the 21st century. FDA needs to access regulatory information quickly, hold all parties responsible for the quality of products in the supply chain, and have reasonable and reliable options for enforcement. I'll now turn to the drug safety authorities in FDAA, a milestone legislative achievement that has helped the agency protect the public health in many ways. FDAA provided important new authorities to enhance our ability to monitor approved drugs after they are marketed and to take definitive action when needed. With our new authority, FDA has required drug sponsors to conduct around 200 post-marketing studies or trials. The agency has required safety-related labeling changes in individual or classes of drugs 32 times and has developed and put into place 10 evaluation and mitigation strategies with elements to support safe use under the REMS designation, all with the goal of better identifying and managing the risks of drugs on the U.S. market. To give you one example, FDA has established a program to support the safe use of a product a medication in patients with a very severe bleeding disorder in which the blood does not clot because of low platelets. This medication, however, has serious side effects, which include blood cancers, bone marrow fibrosis, a risk of blood clots, and even worsened platelets counts when the therapy is stopped. However, it's an important treatment option for patients who have failed to respond to other therapies. By requiring elements to assure safe use, the benefits of the drug can outweigh the risks, and we can provide patients access to this critical product without being concerned that it would be used in other patients and could cause them more harm than good. I also want to note that FDA also reauthorized and amended the Best Pharmaceutical for Children's Act, which continues to provide valuable safety and dosing information for the use of drugs in children. As a pediatrician, I echo the comments of Congresswoman Eshoo, who worked so hard on this issue. This legislation represents a fundamental shift in prescribing for the pediatric population, with even since the passage of the FDA legislation, 109 labeling changes related to the use of medications in children. It's been a tremendous step forward for pediatrics. We're very happy to discuss the lessons we've learned over the last 2 years in implementing FDA and work together to fine-tune the program. Over the last 7 decades, so much has changed in pharmaceutical science and drug regulation. Yet in 2007, when scores of patients died from contamination of medications in Bangladesh, and in 2006, when children died in Panama, the culprit was familiar. It was diethylene glycol, the very same poison that led to the passage of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act in 1938. FDA's work is far from done. The scientists, doctors, nurses, inspectors, and other public health professionals, some of whom are here with me today, who make up FDA, thank you for your support for our mission. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today, and I'm happy to address any questions you may have.
Thank you, Dr. Sharfstein. I appreciate your testimony. It's good. We're just going to have questions, as you know, alternating between the D's and the R's, and I'll start out. I mentioned in my opening statement that this committee worked very hard to pass the Food and Drug Administration Amendments Act of 2007. We called it FDA. And as part of FDA, Congress gave FDA the authority to require manufacturers to implement the so-called REMS, or Risk Evaluation and Mitigation Strategies. They can require REMS when the agency believes it's necessary to ensure that a drug's benefits outweigh its risks. So I wanted to issue initially, could you provide the committee with an update on how FDA has made use of this authority, how many REMS have been required and approved, and what's been the public health impact of REMS?
Sure. There are about around 80 or 90 REMS that have been approved since the passage of the legislation. The vast majority of those are called medication guide only REMS, where the REMS just consists of the fact that we have a medication guide for patients about the drug. There are about 10 REMS for 10 drugs, one each, that have what we call elements to assure safe use. This is sort of the next level of control. And that can include restrictions on which pharmacies can provide the medication, whether the doctor needs special training, and whether there needs to be a patient registry. And these have been used for medications for seizures, for the low platelets that we were talking about before, for medications for schizophrenia. And they really make it possible for FDA to approve the treatment, because without this ability to put some restrictions and some safeguards in place, we would be very worried that these medications could do more harm than good. I think that this is very clearly a work in progress. There are certain things that in the implementation of this provision we've learned about. One of the issues is the differential treatment between generic medications and brand name medications when it comes to communication plans. We can require that companies that make brand name drugs do communication plans for healthcare professionals, but when it comes to generic drugs, the FDA would have to pay for and run the communication plan. So there are a few specific issues, and I'm happy to talk about them more if you want, where we think that we could be more effective with REMS. One of the others is that we have the authority to require a REMS, but we don't necessarily have the authority to require a specific type of REMS. So that leads to negotiations that can go on for a while between the company and FDA. And recently we did a REMS for certain medications that can stimulate the bone marrow that took over a year to develop. So I think that there are definitely areas where this could be improved, but in general, our view is that this is a tremendously important authority, and we're really making a lot of progress with it.
Well, I want to use an example of a drug that came to my attention. And I heard you say you have the authority to require REMS, but not a particular type, and I'd like you to comment on that. But let me throw this example out, and then I don't know if this relates to what you said about the type, but I'd like you to answer that too. So maybe give me a response to that, what you mean by type, that you don't have the authority, but also this example. I'm using this example that there are 3 types of fast-acting fentanyls, I guess is the word, or rapid onset opioids, I guess, on the market right now. And I think it's an example where REMS would be critically important because these are extremely powerful pain relievers or opioids intended to treat breakthrough pain in adult opioid-tolerant cancer patients, but a dose in a non-tolerant patient could be deadly. So it's my understanding that one of these products has a REMS with very different elements from the REMS that is required of the other 2. For example, the REMS dictates that only specially trained, tested, and registered healthcare professionals can actually prescribe the product, and distribution and dispensing that must be done through a specially trained and registered distributor and/or pharmacist. So explain why there would be differences between the elements of REMS for these 3 fast-acting fentanyls. And does that relate back to what you said before about how you can only require the REMS but not different types?
It does relate back to that.
Okay.
And I don't think all of them have what we would call formal REMS. Some of them are sort of in the intermediate stage because they had a risk management program in place when the act was passed. But I think for the purpose of your question, it definitely relates to what I was saying. The way that the law works is it says that we need to take steps to assure safe use, and the company comes to FDA with the proposal on how to accomplish that. And there may be more than one path to get to that goal. One company might say, the path that we want to take is to really work through a series, just a couple pharmacies or a central pharmacy. Another might want to put particular restrictions on which physicians, and so that we have the responsibility of making sure that they work. We're not going to approve something that we don't think is going to hit the mark, but they won't necessarily all look exactly the same. In the case of the fentanyl products, there's one that's for a film that does restrict the pharmacies, and there's others that's more of a lollipop type product in the mouth, and that one has an older risk management plan that we haven't announced the formal REMS for.
Well, then, does this difference in authority make sense to you, or would you like to have the power to dictate the type?
Well, I think it's very important for us to work with companies to come up with something that works. And, there's no question there's a lot we learn from the interchange with companies and what we can hear from others. But I think that it is, when you find that it's taking a long time to come to agreement, and when there may be a level of consistency that we would like to see if one approach really makes sense, I think that we would be very open to discussing ways that we could be able to more effectively move to closure on REMS in a way that makes sense for public health.
Well, my time has run out, but I have to say, this is kind of disconcerting to me, the fact that you don't have the ability to dictate the type, and therefore they end up with these big differences. But, I guess we'll have to take it up at another time because I want to move to the next, to my ranking member, Mr. Shimkus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to follow up on this line of questions also on the REMS. So I think the last question was the time that it takes in negotiations. We see that across the board in the federal government, whether it's citing natural gas pipelines, and we always say that there should be I've said a stop clock, a backstop, that eventually there's a time when you have to make a decision. You let the folks negotiate, but eventually you've got to get to closure. Would a backstop provision be helpful?
Some of the REMS that we're putting into place are coming at the time of approval, And there's a lot of incentive for the company to get its drug approved. And with REMS, the standard is we wouldn't approve the drug without it. So we're not, I mean,
So they have an incentive to get an agreement.
those are happening, but it's when the drug is already marketed.
Well, let me go to the generic brand name. You did allude in your opening testimony that there's a difference between your ability to affect, I thought I heard, in negotiations between a generic and a brand name. Can you clarify that a little bit better?
Sure. That relates to this provision about communication plans. So one of the things that we can do is require a company to make certain communications to healthcare professionals.
But why can't that be placed on the generic producer of the drug?
Someone's going to tap me on the shoulder if I get this wrong, but I think that the law doesn't allow us to do that for generics.
So the issue would be a responsibility for us to address if we're going to move forward to help assist that. Okay, thanks. The other question I wanted to talk about was also alluded in my opening statement, and in your in the FDA week inside Washington on January 22nd, on the second page it says, as FDA struggles with whether to relax conflict of interest policies that have made it difficult to fill slots in the pharmaceutical advisory panel. So you all, the FDA is saying we have problems filling these slots. We have a tendency, there are the unforeseen consequences of legislation. And I think what we're seeing to some extent is these advisory panels, because of which we can't fill. We pulled up from the website Gastrointestinal Drug Advisory Committee, where there's 5 openings that you all identified. You know, our office has a personal experience with someone who, you know, had a catastrophic, you know, death because of this. What do you tell us, and is there anything we need to do to ease legislatively? I mean, the response was to make sure there was no conflict of interest and people weren't benefiting from their advisory role while benefiting financially, but we've got to be careful that we don't go overboard and that we lose all this expertise. You alluded to some of that in your opening statement too. What can you tell us, and what advice can you give us?
Sure. Well, this is an issue which clearly requires a balance, and it's a balance that Congress faced in writing the law. It's a balance that the agency faces. On one hand, we clearly would prefer advisors who don't have conflict of interest, and it's really important for us to look for qualified advisors who don't have a conflict of interest. On the other hand, the agency needs to get the best advice in order to make the best decisions. And there are certain situations where the people who have the best advice and unique expertise are going to have conflicts of interest. So you've got to somehow, you know, balance those two things. And I think the bill did a very good job and gives the agency some leeway to figure out how to do that. And within the scope of what the legislation has done, it gives us the ability to figure out the right spot. And I'll be more specific. The legislation sets a cap on the number of waivers that we can have for advisory committees, and that cap goes down over time. I think it's somewhere in the ballpark of 13%. But we are right now well under that. I think we're granting waivers, you know, like 4 to 5% of the people who are on the advisory committees are getting waivers. So without changing the law, we have the ability, if we think that it's important to get certain members, to grant more waivers. If we were,
But let me ask a question, just because my time's running, and I'm on this from the FDA and the website. You've got quite a few vacancies listed or not. Now, I don't know what to, you know, relate that to, because I didn't pull up the previous month or I didn't look at last year's. Is this excessive vacancies? We've got anywhere from 21 in one of the areas. Well, in fact, pharmaceutical science is 21 vacancies. Advisory Committee Reproductive Health Drugs, there's 8 vacancies. There's 9 in drug safety and risk management. I think that looks like there's a lot of vacancies. And if that is, then maybe we need to.
Right. Well, I don't like vacancies on the advisory committees. We would definitely, you know, we definitely want to fill them. I actually asked the advisory committee team whether they felt that there were more now, and they said that they've always had vacancies. They couldn't say that there are more now. Having said that, I think it's important for us to strike the right balance. And we do. It's not I think, a question for the statute, because the statute gives us more room. If we feel the right decision is, you know, to grant people more waivers, we've got plenty of room under the statutory cap. It's really up to what the people at FDA want to do. I think the way Dr. Hamburg and I are looking at this is there are situations where it's important for us to get the best advice from someone who requires a waiver. We need to take into account the type of conflict they may have, the type of decision that's being asked for, and make good decisions. But we're prepared. We understand that will be necessary.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you. Chairman Dingell.
Thank you. Dr. Sharfstein, I want you to understand these are friendly questions. I want yes or no answers. You're familiar with the heparin crisis, which caused 81 American deaths. Does FDA currently have the adequate resources, personnel, and authorities to prevent another heparin crisis?
No.
Do you have the ability to control the safety of imported pharmaceuticals?
Not to the extent we'd like.
Do you have the authority and resources to address the safety of components being now imported into this country?
No, not to the extent we'd like.
Do you have the authorities and resources to see to it that good manufacturing practices are properly observed overseas?
No, not to the extent we
would. Would you please submit to the committee the number of people that you have at the different ports to assure the safety and the inspection of pharmaceuticals coming into this country? And also, would you give us the number of people that you need to see to it that this is done? Please submit that for the record.
Sure.
Do you have adequate authority to keep out unsafe drug shipments at the border?
No.
Do you have authority to require manufacturers to ensure the safety of their supply chain?
No.
Do you have the authority to see to it that good manufacturing practices are observed in this country on both foods and drugs and abroad? Yes or no?
Not to the extent we'd like, no.
Does FDA have the authority to require mandatory drug recalls?
No.
Now, do you have authorities, or rather, do you have cooperative management agreements or letters of cooperation between Food and Drug, the Department of Homeland Security, and other agencies that have personnel at the points of entry?
We do work closely with other agencies at the point of entry.
Do you have the...
Mr. Dingell, excuse me. Can you speak more into the mic because I can barely hear you?
I'm sorry about that.
That's all right.
Do you have adequate authority to require mandatory drug recall?
No.
Do you need that authority?
We would like that authority, yes.
Would you like it, or do you need it?
I'd say we need it.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, you have also the legislation down there in H.R. 759, which gives you additional authorities that was introduced by Mr. Pallone, Mr. Stupak, Ms. Sutton, and Ms. DeGette and I. That would give you significant authorities to address your current lack of capability. Is that right?
That legislation has some very important elements, yes.
It would also give you the resources which you need of a financial character by enabling you to collect fees from both manufacturers of food and from pharmaceuticals. Is that right?
It does have that provision, yes.
And you can do that both at home and abroad. Is that right?
I believe so, yes.
And those are those resources and those fees included in your budget submissions to the Congress that the administration has submitted?
I don't believe so.
You don't? I understood they were.
I'm sorry, for food it is, yes.
For food?
I drugs, yes, for food.
How about pharmaceuticals?
I don't believe so, no.
But that is built into your budget with regard to food.
Correct.
Now, it's a curious situation that I have observed that you were in the awkward place at Food Drug of having somebody being able to bring unsafe foods into the United States, and you can't catch them at the point of entry. But you also have the problem, if you do catch them, you don't have authority to seize, impound, or to destroy. Is that right?
Yes.
So you send them back out. That's right?
I believe so. Often that's what happens.
And they then bring them back in. Is that right? Through another port of entry.
I think they can try, yes.
Now, do you have that same problem with regard to pharmaceuticals?
Yes.
So that problem exists in both places. Now, you have problems with unsafe commodities being brought in, foods and pharmaceuticals, and you also have some that are overaged, improperly stored, contaminated, filthy, improperly packaged, counterfeit, and you also have some that are full of inert substances. You mentioned talcum powder and things like that coming in. Do you have authority to deal with those?
I mean, we have some authorities, but not enough.
You have enough?
We don't have enough.
As proven by heparin.
Yes, in part.
And of course, you have, in coming in from into this country from China on a fairly regular basis, and from Mexico and other places, unsafe foods and pharmaceuticals. And I can recall mushrooms, I can recall berries, I can recall tomatoes and jalapeno peppers, I can recall the heparin scare, and a large number of others. This is an ongoing and continuing problem, is it not?
Absolutely.
And you lack the congressional support and both authority and money to do the job that you need to do to protect the American people. Isn't that right?
Well, we very much want to do more.
I don't want you to be afraid to say it, that we haven't given you the authority you need.
Well, we want more authority. I hear
if
you.
it's the truth, because we're going to try and get it for you. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your courtesy.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Dingell. The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Pitts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Going back to this concern for counterfeit drugs, there's a growing global threat from counterfeit medicines. And, for example, in 2008, counterfeit medicine article seizures rose 118% in the European Union, and 8.9 million counterfeit medicine articles were seized by EU customs officials. Over just a 2-month period in 2008, the European Commission seized 34 million counterfeit pills, including antibiotics, cancer, cholesterol, and anti-malaria medicines. Does this staggering increase in counterfeiting in places like the EU present concerns to the United States, and can you quantify it for us?
Definitely does present concerns, and I think that the problems with counterfeit products, first of all, they can be just dangerous in and of themselves, but second of all, they can fail to treat the condition that the patient has, and the patient can get much sicker if they're taking medicines that are ineffective or subpotent. So it presents a serious problem, and I think the problems that we see globally are very much a potential threat to the United States. In terms of quantifying the problem, I can't unfortunately quantify how many counterfeits are in the United States. We do see that reports that we've been investigating have gone up over the last few years, so that our investigators at FDA are hearing about this problem more. But we do think that in general we do not have a huge problem with counterfeit, in part because we have a generally closed system. When pharmacies order medications, they can get them through licensed wholesalers who can get them from licensed manufacturers. But we know that there are ways for other products to enter the legitimate supply chain, and that makes us concerned. You may remember in 2003 there were several million, I think, pills of Lipitor that were counterfeit that got into pharmacies. And there are other problems, too. Recently we had a situation where a truck full of insulin was stolen, and then the insulin started showing up later, and we didn't know whether the insulin had been adequately refrigerated, and it had sort of re-entered the supply chain in a way that could potentially have been quite dangerous to patients. So there's no question that the problems seen around the world are of concern to us, and we think that we do need additional work here to really secure the supply chain in the United States against this potential threat.
Now, when you when the U.S. authorities interdict counterfeit drugs here in the United States, what occurs? What is done with those drugs?
When we actually find the drugs and we know that they're counterfeit, I'm not sure, but I think they're just destroyed. If we identify products that are in the supply chain that are that are counterfeit, I can double check, but I think they get destroyed.
Where are the major gaps, in your opinion, as far as interdiction of counterfeit drugs here in the U.S.?
The major gap is that we don't require a pedigree for the product to go all the way from the manufacturer to the final sale, so that even though if people are ordering from the right places, they can get medicines that's safe, and that's why it's and are not counterfeit. There are opportunities for counterfeit products to potentially get in without a clear requirement where we're holding each person in the chain responsible for making sure that they only have legitimate products. So the kind of provisions that we'd like to see are that each person in the supply chain, as it goes from the manufacturer to the wholesaler, they're responsible. If they let something in that's not legitimate, that there's a real penalty for that. And every single person in the supply chain, every single company is responsible for making sure those products are legitimate. And that would require a new authority.
Do you have a regular system or procedure for testing drugs that are coming into the United States that you pursue?
We do some tests. We do some targeted sampling based on where we think the risk is, but it is really only a small part of the solution, the testing. There's no way we could test our way out of the problem just because of the sheer volume of imports.
What is the greatest need that you have as an agency as far as addressing this problem?
I think the greatest need is the ability to enforce the supply chain requirements across the supply chain. That we are have been working on or about to come out with a process for unique numbers for each kind of a bottle of pills, but we don't have the authority to say you're responsible for making sure that every person, when they get the medication, that it's legitimate medication. That's what we'd like.
Thank you, Mr.
Would gentlemen yield for
I'll
one
yield.
second? But that discussion was all about the legal distribution chain. You haven't even addressed the illegal, like the illegal websites and the illegal mail order sites. That if some senior goes on a website, clicks on 90-day supply of Lipitor, and it gets mailed to them, there's no way. We don't know.
Yeah.
Is that correct? I mean, that was a good discussion about the legal process of all the good actors. I think the concern that most of us have is the bad actors.
Well, we have brought some cases, I think, recently against bad actors in the legitimate chain, and the ability of products to infiltrate the legitimate supply chain is something that we need to be very vigilant about. But you were right, you're raising a separate issue that is very important, and I think this gets a little bit to the issue that Congressman Boyer and Congressman Matheson were raising about destruction authority and other things, and that's also an issue that we care about.
Yeah, and I only bring it up because there's really, I agree with your statements, but I think for most of us, it's that other issue that has us more concerned than anything.
Right.
I appreciate the gentleman yielding.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from the Virgin Islands, Ms. Christensen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing, and welcome back, Dr. Sharfstein. First of all, I can attest to the answer to Chairman Dingell's question about collaboration with other agencies, because Customs and Border Protection acts on behalf of FDA at the Puerto Rico transit station, and your staff knows where I'm going. I can see them nodding. To confiscate medication going to and from the Virgin Islands. But I'm not sure if you're aware of this problem, but I have to bring it up, and your staff is aware of it, and we are outside of the U.S. Customs Zone. We're fully part of the United States. We're outside of the U.S. Customs Zone. All of our pharmacists are U.S. trained, and while they're locally licensed, they have their U.S. DEA license and are governed like the Virgin Islands are in general by all U.S. laws, and they're governed by all FDA rules and regulations. They order their medication, I'm including my hospital pharmacies, which are also overseen by JCO and CMS. They order their medication from distributors in the states. These are either U.S.-made medication or something that FDA has approved for importation into the United States. They cannot send it back to their distributor. They are prohibited because we're outside of the customs zone from sending it back to their distributor. If they're oversupplied, if they're damaged, if they're expired. It's an extreme burden on my pharmacies. My hospital pharmacy has been cited by one of the certifying agencies for having too many expired drugs in the pharmacy. If we could craft a narrow, some narrow language, and we've tried, that would just allow our pharmacies to send their medication back to the place that they bought it from. Would you be willing to take a look at that?
Oh, absolutely. And I do recall you raising this issue before, and I know that there are people at FDA who've been actually in touch with entities in the Virgin Islands to work on
Yes, we've had some conference calls.
Yeah. So, you know, I'm extremely sympathetic to the situation that they're in, and I think we would like to find a solution.
I appreciate that. And the other question is about importation, but sort of, well, I don't consider ours importation or reimportation of drugs, because they're U.S.-made drugs, U.S. pharmacies, it's a U.S. jurisdiction. But Congress and FDA acknowledge that there have been numerous safety, as well as others, safety issues related to drug importation. And I voted against it when I had the opportunity. One of the issues I'm concerned about from a safety perspective is the importation of products subject to the REMS requirements that have been discussed in other ways here today. Does the FDA support this posture that they can be reimported subject to the REMS requirements? And how does FDA view the reimportation safety concerns as they relate to the REMS process? And would FDA consider an exemption of certain, ever under any circumstances, consider an exemption of certain drugs under a reimportation policy if it would lead to the obfuscation of the REMS requirements? Is that,
sure, thank you.
Clear?
I think I understand. You know, the administration supports finding a safe and effective way for patients to obtain medications from other countries, but it's a challenge because there are a lot of safety concerns, and certainly one of the safety concerns that would have to be overcome is trying to figure out what to do with the products that have a narrow therapeutic window, or another way of saying that, where you're worried that they could actually do more harm than good, where you have a REMS in place or other medicines where it depends on how they're used, and that very much would be an issue for us, I think. And we would not want people to get medications but without the kind of controls that are needed to ensure their safe use.
Is this something that we need to do to, or is this something, the improvements that need to be made, or the becoming more assured of the safety and use of the REMS process, is it something that we need to do, or is it something that FDA can do administratively?
I don't think there's an issue before Congress on this point right now, but if there is, we can be in touch. But I think that the premise of your question, that there are certain drugs we have to be very careful about, that does underline FDAA, and that's something that FDA feels very strongly about.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, Dr. Sharfstein, thank you for being with us and staying with us late this afternoon. On the issue of resources, we've heard, I don't know how many times in this committee and the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations about inadequate resourcing of the agency, and that the resources haven't kept pace with the increasing demands placed on the FDA. The fact that now you're having to really function as almost a global agency with budgets that 10 years ago seemed adequate, but now you seem significantly underfunded. it always happens, and in fact, I was on this committee for several years before I realized that the funding actually comes through the USDA appropriations bill, not through HHS. And is that funding structure? I mean, that's something that you all have to deal with. But should we consider some way modernizing how Congress funds the FDA?
You know, I think over the last few years, FDA has gotten tremendous amount of new resources, and the subcommittees, both of which I testified at last year, were extremely supportive of the agency. And the agency really has been using those resources to develop a real foundation for the future on these issues. I think that it's not just resources that are an issue when it comes to an issue like safe drugs and imported safe drugs. We need to be able to secure the supply chain, hold people in the supply chain accountable, set good standards.
Okay, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I will run out of time here. But, Mr. Chairman, if you will just make note that the witness testified that they have all the money they need and that Congress does not need to supply any more. But it begs the next question, and I know this is a drug safety hearing, but you must get a tremendous volume of new drug applications. Is that not correct?
I think that there's a tremendous amount of work when it comes to the new drug applications and additional indications for existing drugs. So there are a lot of different types of applications that the agency has to handle, yes.
Any idea as to the magnitude of the backlog?
Well, there's not really a backlog when it comes to the new drug applications. We're on a clock, and we do our best to hit the goals of review timetables. When it comes to generic drugs, there is a backlog. It's a different type of review process, a different type of application, and there are several thousand applications that are kind of in the queue to be approved.
Well, for example, I mean, we plussed up funding for the National Institute of Health in the stimulus bill, a significant amount of money. And the idea was, of course, to generate new research and new discoveries. Do you have what you need to keep pace with the rapidity of those new discoveries and new developments?
That's an excellent question, and slightly different than just reviewing the applications. I think that FDA and Dr. Hamburg has been very engaged on this issue. We feel that the agency needs to do a lot more to be able to review the products of the 21st century, and that involves an updating and upgrading our scientific standards for review, and it involves a lot of needed investments, not just by the government, but by academia and others, in what we call regulatory science, which is the science of how you know whether something is safe and effective. And for example, we want to be able to identify a safety problem very quickly in the lab and not require not have a company go all this, spend all this time and money in development and then find the safety problem. Let's identify that quickly. If there's a way on the effectiveness side to find a marker that a drug will be effective without having to require a tremendous amount of and long amount of time before we show that it works, that's just an enormous benefit to the drug development process. And that is separate from the review of any one application, but that area of regulatory science and those kinds of investments are extremely important. The President's budget for the first time has an initiative on that, but over the course of the future, this is where we think that there needs to be a lot more done.
Well, just as a case in point, a real-world example, yesterday the Alzheimer's Association was on the Hill visiting every office, asking for a significant plus-up in funding for Alzheimer's research, a noble goal, worthwhile goal. This comes on top of the reauthorization we did at NIH back in 2006, level funding of $30 billion a year to increase 5% a year. I don't know that we've ever met those goals, but then the $10 billion in addition to the authorized amount that we gave in the stimulus bill, now we're asking, at least in the Alzheimer's legislation that Mr. Markey has, another $2 billion to put forward to the research for new Alzheimer's drugs. Can you guys keep up with that? If you've got that kind of push in the pipeline for new products coming down?
Well, I'll tell you that the analogy that Dr. Hamburg uses when she talks about this is a rower with one very muscular arm and one kind of scrawny arm. And if we're pouring a lot into basic medical research, but we don't have the science to decide whether the products are safe and effective, then you don't get a system that moves forward. It kind of goes in circles. You don't see the treatments that we all want.
Are you aligning yourself to that, to making a more muscular
Yes,
science
and in
arm?
fact, a few weeks ago, the Secretary of Health, Kathleen Sebelius, went out to NIH with Dr. Collins and Dr. Hamburg, and we announced a whole set of collaborations with NIH to bridge the gap, so that it's not that money goes to NIH and then here's FDA on the other side, but that we're going to have, in addition to a public meeting and open docket for suggestions on how we can work together, we're going to have a council that's going to meet and oversee a whole new range of collaborations. And for the first time, both agencies are putting in money to fund this kind of research in academia around regulatory science.
But at the present time, if to the extent that those new discoveries are arriving on your doorstep, there is no backlog. Those applications are receiving timely review, and
it's just not a question of the timeliness of the review. It's the tools we have. We would like to upgrade the tools we have for the new types of products.
Are all of those applications online? Is that all in an electronic database?
We are moving towards full electronic submission, but
some of those applications are paper applications.
In some cases, but I think we're moving pretty quickly to electronic. But I think the issue is
that here, and I'll just give you a real-world example. If this were a class action lawsuit, for example, a big law firm, any of the big law firms downtown or in downtown Dallas, would hire the people to digitize that data and then have it done within a couple of months' time, in order to make their case either pro or con in the legal action. This is something that is done all the time by outside organizations. The FDA should be the leader on this.
There's no question that we need to have electronic data submissions, and we want to do it in a way that the data comes in so it can be analyzed very efficiently. The challenge is it's not so much the review of the applications that comes in, it's that we don't get the applications. Products don't make it all the way to the point where they have enough evidence to get to FDA's doorstep. That's the kind of gulf we're trying to cross by working with the NIH, that they do the research, they go, oh, maybe this product works. Then how do you get from there to the point where you can do clinical trials? And I mean, what's the right kind of clinical trial to do? What's the right tool to know? How do you get the companies in, ready to invest? That's the value.
Then after companies have made that investment and then they come to you for the approval, that's the part of the chain that I'm worried about.
Right.
That you have the tools you need to be able to get these things to the people who so desperately need them.
And I agree with that completely, and we also want more drugs to come to our doorstep than are coming now. More applications. We would like to see that happen because there are a lot of people who have diseases that need medicines.
How many applications, I don't know what time frame would be the correct unit, but how many new drug applications per month or quarter or fiscal year?
I think, I'll ask, I think it's like a ballpark of about per year. Yeah, so 25 completely new drugs getting approved by the FDA roughly every year.
How many applications, though, how many new drug applications that seek approval will you get a year? So 25 make it through the...
Yeah. Yeah, this is Dr. Woodcock from
okay.
FDA, about 30 to 35. That's my point about we would like to see more. We would like to, but to do that we have to help the discoveries bridge the way to the point of FDA application.
Interestingly, Dr. Zerhouni at NIH 8 years ago told me that they were working on, I think it was no fewer than 88 drugs to deal with obesity.
Yeah.
With that kind of pressure in the research pipeline, I mean, you guys are going to have to be really precise and efficient to be able to handle that kind of research coming your direction.
I think that's true. What we want to do is help NIH, as it's investing in those 88 or however many it is products, use that investment so it's pushing the products closer to an FDA application rather than being all these different steps to get there. And so that's one of the things we're going to work with them on. If NIH is going to pay for a trial, what's the right way to design that so that we get really good usable data for an application? So it's really it's not so much once the application comes in, we need better tools to review them, but it's how you get more applications of promising therapies. That's what Dr. Hamburg is extremely committed to and why we're doing this big project with NIH.
Dr. Burgess, we're actually going to have a second round, so just want you to know. Mr. Braley.
Thank you. Dr. Sharfstein, I want to start with a word that we hear still today frequently called mail-order drugs. And in this internet age, isn't that somewhat of an oxymoron? There's a very specific reason I'm asking you this question. We heard our colleague, Dr. Gingrey, spend his time that he had in his opening, instead of talking about drug safety, blasting the healthcare legislation we're considering right now. But when you've got 47 million Americans without access to health insurance, and a lot of people losing their jobs with employer-based health care coverage, and you've got people who are on prescription drugs who suddenly have no means because they can't afford to pay their COBRA payments without a job, who go online, like many of us, and surf for some answer to their medication needs. There are endless websites out there of predatory companies looking to sell what may or may not be an actual pharmaceutical to somebody desperate for treatment. Would you agree with that?
I think it's a recipe for tragedy.
And we all know that the problem is your agency has limited resources. You're dealing with research applications, you're dealing with enforcement issues overseas, you're dealing with enforcement and compliance in domestic manufacturers. So I guess my question is, if we do nothing to improve access and affordability for prescription drugs, aren't we just inviting chaos as consumers look to these disreputable online companies? And I'm not lumping all online companies into that category, but there are plenty of them out there. Aren't desperate people going to resort to desperate measures to try to solve their health care needs?
I think there's no question that healthcare reform that gets more Americans access to prescription drug coverage is extraordinarily important for avoiding the kinds of problems we're talking about.
Thank you. One of the things that I wanted to talk to you about was your remarks about the Sentinel Initiative, because I'm interested in learning more about that, what it was based upon, what model it was based upon, and how it's going to achieve the objective of a national integrated electronic system for monitoring medical product safety. And Dr. Christensen mentioned JCO, which is looked to by many people as a forerunner in setting up a Sentinel event reporting system with root cause analysis and an integrated approach to trying to get to the bottom of patient safety issues. In its first 10 years of existence, the Sentinel event reporting system averaged annually 300 reports, which is an abysmal statistic given the high number of medical errors that occur in this country every year. So tell me how this Sentinel initiative that FDA is pursuing is going to achieve the objective and the access data goals that you've identified and truly reach a comprehensive reporting system that's going to get to the heart of patient and drug safety.
Sure. I appreciate the question. And what we're doing in the Sentinel system of JCO are very, very different. They have the same word, but they're very, very different. There, I think what you're describing is a sort of a reporting system where people actually have to report. That's not what the FDA Sentinel system is based on. The concept is that there are data resources out there, generally large integrated health systems, where you have data for millions of Americans who are taking medications, and that we can use that information in a way that is completely protective of their confidentiality. In fact, the data as in what we're looking at doesn't come to the federal government. It's done by the systems themselves. They look into their system to answer key questions about drug safety, and over time we put into place a system to look in advance. In other words, we're concerned that a particular product might cause a problem. We can program it so that if we see that when patients are getting it, it automatically lets us know. That's the long-term goal.
Let me just interrupt you briefly to add another component to this because my time is running out. But there's been a big push, not only in the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act that we passed earlier in 2009, but also in this healthcare bill that we've been talking about to move aggressively toward electronic medical records, which we all know is one way to try to deal with drug interactions and to dramatically reduce the number of drug errors. So is that another reason why getting it right on EMR is so important in addressing some of the goals of this Sentinel initiative?
No, absolutely. If we have more patients with effective medical records, and we are working with the Office of the National Coordinator to make sure the standards in those records are good for this kind of work, then we'll be able to tap into more Americans' experiences with medications to identify whether there are legitimate safety issues that we have to respond to. So, where we are now is that we are working with certain healthcare systems that have data, and we're setting up basic standards so that they will be able to respond to inquiries. It's a system where we don't need anyone to volunteer anything. Once we have a question, they go out and they just program their data set, and they tell us whether they're seeing that. And it's a network, so it's not just a one big database. It's we're going to go up to New England, and there's a data set there. There's a data set in California, and we're going to be able to look in a much quicker way than we can do now to see if there are safety signals emerging. And there's been a lot of work done at FDA. We're constantly reviewing how this is going to make sure we're keeping it on track. It's a very ambitious project, but there's been a tremendous amount of leadership at the agency on it, and we're very appreciative of the support we've gotten.
Thank you. I will yield back, and I would just encourage you to keep us informed on the progress you're making in the rollout of that system.
Sure.
Thank you. Gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Whitfield.
Thank you very much. I have a relatively simple question, but as you continue to work and develop the REMS program, and I'd mentioned in my opening statement about NASPR, the National Prescription Drug Monitoring System, I was curious, have you yourself worked, or your agency worked very much with DEA or SAMHSA in implementing this National Prescription Drug Monitoring System?
It's an excellent question, and that that system is primarily dedicated to the scheduled drugs.
Right.
Right. And we have been having some public meetings about how to ensure the safe use of certain scheduled drugs that have very important medical uses. They're long-acting opiate medicines. And, our reach in the REMS program goes really to the manufacturers and what they could do.
Right.
But we're very aware that there are other key players, and we have been in discussions with DEA and others to try to figure out what the right balance is. We clearly know that patients benefit from pain relief, and it's extremely important. On the other hand, we don't like to see that the fact that patients can die of unnecessary overdoses, or there can be diversion. So it's a combination, and we have some tools to put on the table to help with this balance, and we're very aware that the other agencies do, and the Prescription Drug Monitoring Program is very much part of the discussion.
Well, I appreciate that, and of course REMS is designed to minimize risk for patients, and certainly NASPR that's the same goal of NASPR as well, to give the healthcare providers more information. So I hope that you all will keep that in your mind as we move forward on trying to obtain adequate funding to fully implement NASPR.
Thank you. It's an excellent point.
Dr. Sharfstein, you describe in your testimony the importance of moving from a reactive approach to drug safety problems to one that prevents such problems from occurring in the first place. Obviously, prevention is what we're all about in every aspect of healthcare. As you know, the committee worked very closely with the FDA to develop and pass the Food Safety Enhancement Act this past summer. We're now waiting for the Senate to pass its version, which we hope will be very similar to our bill. I understand they did pass a bill out of committee. In my view, one of the most critical components of the food safety legislation was giving the food industry more responsibility to ensure the safety of their foods, and giving FDA more authority to ensure that preventive safety controls are in place. And you mentioned this provision in your testimony and stated that FDA is taking steps to begin making this kind of shift within your current authorities. Now, what I'm trying to understand is whether your current authorities are adequate to accomplish this. The Food and Drug Administration Globalization Act of 2009. That's the bill that was developed, Mr. Dingell, myself, Mr. Stupak, and others. And that contains a similar provision to that in the Food Safety Bill. Specifically, Section 204 of that bill would require drug companies to develop and implement a quality risk management plan to incorporate risk identification and control into their production processes. The plan would, for example, require the company to assess the competence of potential suppliers of raw materials or ingredients. It would also require the company to conduct periodic on-site audits and carefully monitor the safety of drug ingredients, and this plan would be available for FDA review during inspections. So what I'm trying to find out is whether you think this approach is workable and necessary for drugs, as we did for foods, and would it help FDA's efforts to shift to a more preventive-based drug safety system if the agency had that kind of enforceable authority?
Thank you. It's a great question, and it is in fact true that the same principle that underlies the Food Safety Bill and a lot of the authorities there is needed in the medical product arena also. We do think that new authorities are going to be necessary for FDA to have confidence in a preventive-oriented approach. Right now, FDA inspectors are at the border under a legal standard that we can hold something if there's an appearance of adulteration. But we can't require, we don't have access because we can't require people to have current registration for, just those facilities that they're making. We can't require them to present information about their products meeting key safety standards like having a preventive plan in place. And so we're not operating under a paradigm that is really focused on prevention, and we would like to make that shift, and there are definitely elements in the bill that would accomplish that.
I appreciate that. I mean, when we did this Globalization Act, we had the 4 areas. You mentioned medical devices. There's also cosmetics. And, of course, ultimately we'd like to develop legislation or pass legislation for all 4, but we separated out the food safety because we were making more progress and felt that that was the most likely that we could move. But now we want to move to certainly deal with the drugs and ultimately with the others as well. So I just ask that I know you provided a lot of help to us as we developed the food safety legislation. We'd like to have the same cooperation and help as we move towards drug safety and the others. Appreciate it.
Great. Well, we really appreciate the subcommittee's leadership in this area.
Thank you. Mr. Shimkus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a good line of questions and debate and instruction, so I'm glad we're going down this route. I want to go back to we were involved with the legislation that's pending over on the Senate side now. And so it is a template for where we want to move, but we need to get some clarification. Does the FDA have tools at its disposal to have a company take its drug off the market? Do you have the tools right now?
Mm-hmm. There are mechanisms for FDA to have drugs. You mean if a drug is unsafe?
Right.
Yes, there's a process for that.
So we do have the tools.
There are. If there's a safety problem with the medicine, so it's no longer safe and effective, yes.
Okay.
There's a process for that.
And so in the past years, you have asked drug companies to take drugs that are identified as being bad off the market, have you not?
Yes.
Has any company ever refused to do so?
I have to go back, but not that I know of.
Yeah, please get that. It would be there has been a company that's refused?
I think I shouldn't say not that I know, but I think we'd have to get back to you because there may be some examples of that. But I think that you have to distinguish between there are 2 things. One is the products, and the other is the manufacturing, whether there are manufacturing issues that could come up as well.
Okay, the follow-on question, because we really want to drill down, because we know you've got the ability to do. We just don't want to unilaterally say, boom, here's all this new stuff if there are things that you're doing successfully now. We don't want to create multiple additional new levels of bureaucracy. We want to build on what's working now. And so that's why we want to be very specific with our questions.
Sure. The one thing I would say is that it's important that, there may be a process to accomplish something, but if that process is so burdensome and time-consuming, it may not be fully protective of public health. So as we get back on these things to provide technical assistance, it may be that, yes, that there's a process, but we would like a better process, a simpler process that can be more effective.
In your response to Chairman Dingell, you stated that you needed additional authority to require manufacturers to implement quality risk management plans. And the follow-up question is, do you actually need this authority, or is that something you can do now? Could you just incorporate this into your good manufacturing practice regulations?
I think we feel like we would need the authority.
I think we need to talk more.
Yeah, but
I'm not sure we all know.
I'm always happy to talk more, but I think that what
we're going to. That's the whole thing. When we move legislation, we're going to get more specific, and you're going to help educate us, and we're going to be use all the resources we need.
They're very different, and it's similar to the food safety language, because even though there are food GMPs, we get authority under the food language to set preventive standards.
But having been in the room on that, we struck a good balance that we didn't go overboard, and that we brought industry at the table so that we didn't duplicate things. Right. And
I agree.
And that's where we want to be very, very, because we want to be helpful. We don't want to be harmful. We don't want to create and we talked about this gap. You talked about really this gap from NIH to FDA, and you know what tides the companies over to continue to develop these new drugs, and that's the certainty that if they're successful, they have a patent, and they have a return on that investment. And of course, we're always attacking that patent. We do want to attack. I've always been in a position that when they game the system and extend that, but I've always supported these folks who are taking the risk all these years. That gap, the only thing that keeps them going is that assurance that there's going to get a return on that investment based upon at least some period of time where they have exclusive rights to sell that drug. Isn't that correct?
I think that it's very important that the companies have some protection.
And I'm going to end on this as far as my line. I do appreciate this. It's going to be, as we move forward, I have great respect for the chairman of this committee. There's times when we've agreed and we worked well together, and there's times when we fought and we still are friends. And so I look forward to both times as we move forward. But I also want to be careful. And I'm also on the high-tech committee here, and I understand the benefits of digital records, and we're always going to fall into this concern on privacy and the collection of data, and it is a tough balance. So when we hear words about collecting information on personal records that help us do something, I think that's going to be easier said than done.
Right, and just to be clear, what I was talking about, the Sentinel system, there's no personal data at all that comes to FDA. It's done by the health systems themselves, the studies.
I'm just telling you, and most data breaches are people stealing data, and
it's a
selling
very serious
it
issue
with flash drives and stuff. So, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a good hearing and a good discussion. I hope we actually have an opportunity to have a similar discussion regarding medical devices at some point in the future, because they deserve no less of our scrutiny. Dr. Sharfstein, I wasn't in the room when Mr. Dingell was asking you questions, but some of them have sort of been reintroduced now by Mr. Shimkus on the border authority. Well, we all remember the story of the tomatoes a couple of years ago, and the unfortunate discovery at 5 o'clock on a Friday afternoon that it was Mexican peppers that were causing the salmonella outbreaks that had riveted the news shows for the whole summer. But the FDA lacked the authority to actually stop the importation at that point. Have you identified the authority that you need there to keep this occurrence from happening in the future? Are there things you need from us to be able to have that authority if you've identified the authority and you lack it?
With respect to food, particularly?
Particularly with respect to food, but we're going to get into some of the pharmaceuticals in a minute.
But there's no question we need more authority, because we want to shift to prevention. We need to be able to see.
So can you identify for us specifically what that authority is that you need?
Well, I think that's where we worked with the committee, and that the legislation that is hopefully going to pass is going to address that gap. And there are sections that relate to what is required to import food.
And is the language in the bill that Mr. Dingell said was languishing safely in the Senate, is that language enough? Is it going to provide you enough of the authority of what you need to have?
Yes, I think that we support that legislation because it's going to be an enormous step forward for how we can assure the safety of imported food and domestic food.
So any changes that occur over in the other body then would need to be scrutinized pretty carefully to make certain that they didn't strip away the authority that you've identified that you will need.
Well, there's no question. All these provisions are extremely important, and it's very important that we look at all of them as they get modified in the legislative process.
Another story that really just riveted the headlines 2 years ago was the Chinese heparin story. What has happened? We had a hearing, I think, in April or May of 2008. It hasn't really been in the news stories. What is happening in that investigation now? Is there anything new that has come up from your looking into the manufacture of or the isolation of heparin overseas? Are we still importing the active pharmaceutical ingredient from overseas? Where
Yes,
are we in that?
There's certainly a huge level of import from China for heparin. I think what's really happened since that time is after the source of the problem was identified, there was a new standard written for heparin that has been adopted by companies and regulators around the world. It's been incorporated into the USP, which is sort of the standard setting body, so that now, previously, it wouldn't have caught the problem and over-sulfated chondroitin sulfate, right?
It was a very clever contaminant to hide behind.
Right, much cheaper than heparin, but evaded the tests, went below the radar. FDA played a critical role in identifying how you can find that contaminant, demonstrated that when you add that contaminant to heparin, you get the problem in animals, and then set up a standard that has been incorporated around the world, and we haven't seen those kinds of reports that we were getting since that time.
Well, now, heparin wouldn't truly be regarded as a biologic, but there has been some question in this committee about how your agency would administer the follow-on biologic approval process. So in light of everything, do you feel like you've got an adequate ability to safely and properly monitor and implement the approval process for follow-on biologics, or what are referred to as follow-on biologics?
From the perspective of the supply chain, I think for all medications and biologics, we would like to see some strengthening of the supply chain, including for things that are there now. But
right, the supply chain in this sense just showed the weakness, though, of the process used to identify contaminants. In approving follow-on biologics, I mean, it just underscores how important the safety aspect is. Do you feel that with what you have available to monitor and screen the follow-on biologics in that process, and we've had that debate somewhat in this committee. We've never had you guys in to ask you about that. We've had the Federal Trade Commission in, which I never understood. So now that I've got you here, what about the discussion on follow-on biologics? I
think that the follow-on biologics sort of supply chain issues are the same as for the regular. In some cases, they're the same companies making them.
Outside the supply chain, just the overall safety of follow-on biologics.
That's something that is very important to base on the individual product and the best science available. And FDA believes that with adequate resources and the right.
You said you had all the money you needed. Remember the previous question.
I think we could check the transcript on that one. I think that that what we would like is the flexibility to have standards that are based on the best available science for particular products. And with that in place, we would explain and how we're setting up those standards and be able to do it in a way that could get products on the market that could be enormously important to the public.
So where are we in that process now? We had some language in the bill that we passed, and goodness knows what's going to happen to that bill, but Are you all waiting for Congress to do something?
I think we're certainly waiting to see what happens with healthcare reform, because there is some language in there, and but I think that we would also look to the authority we have to decide whether it would make sense for us to move forward without new language, but that's not something we've reached a final decision on.
Is there a product out there right now that is awaiting your ability to be able to offer those approvals or direct further study?
There's certainly a lot of interest in the industry, but I don't know if I could point to a particular product.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome. Let me thank Dr. Sharfstein. Thanks a lot. This was very helpful.
Okay.
I appreciate it. And obviously, we would like to move forward on the drug safety issue as we did on food safety. You actually said that you're going to follow up with certain written responses in some cases, so appreciate those as soon as possible. And
sure.
Members will have, members can submit additional questions for the record as well. I'm going to try to get those submitted to the clerk within the next 10 days, so I would ask members if they want to submit written questions to give them to us within the next 10 days, and then after that, we'd ask you to get back to us as quickly as possible.
Okay, great.
So, thank you again, and without objection, the hearing of the subcommittee is adjourned.